It was a quiet morning in Daito, a residential city nestled in the outskirts of Osaka, Japan. The kind of place where life moves slowly, where neighbors pass each other in hallways without exchanging much more than a nod, where apartment buildings line the streets and nobody really thinks twice about who lives above them or below them. April 28th, 2021 started like any other day, until a phone call changed everything. Emergency services received a distress call. A woman was screaming for help. Officers were dispatched immediately, and when they arrived at the apartment building, nothing could have prepared them for what was waiting inside. They found Momona Yoshioka lying on the floor of her apartment. She was 21 years old, and she was barely alive. Her body had multiple stab wounds across her upper torso and legs. Her head had been struck repeatedly with a heavy object. When investigators looked around the room, they found it immediately, a crowbar, still lying there on the floor, stained with blood. But that wasn't the only weapon in the room. There was something else. Something that stopped the officers cold the moment they saw it. A homemade spear, a wooden pole with a knife tied to the end of it, constructed by hand, deliberately, with clear and calculated intent. This was not something you make in a moment of rage. This was something you build when you have already decided what you are going to do. The apartment was covered in blood. Every surface told the same story. Momona was rushed to the hospital. Doctors worked to save her life, but the injuries she had sustained were catastrophic. The wounds were too deep, too many, too severe. Momona Yoshioka died that day. She was 21 years old, and she had done nothing wrong. To truly understand the weight of what happened in that apartment, you need to know who Momona was. Not just as a victim in a case file, but as a person. Momona Yoshioka grew up in Kyoto, one of Japan's most beloved cities. At 18 years old, she made the move to Daito, settling into her apartment in 2018 and beginning a new chapter of her life as a college student. She was building something: independence, routine, a future. By all accounts, Momona was the kind of person who made the people around her feel good. Friends described her as warm, kind, and genuinely caring. She had a wide social circle, the kind that forms naturally around someone with a magnetic personality. She wasn't someone who isolated herself or kept to herself. She was present. She was connected. She was loved. Like many young people her age, Momona documented her life on Instagram. Small moments from her daily routine. Meals, outings, glimpses of the ordinary life she was living. Nothing dramatic, nothing dark. Just a young woman enjoying being young. There were no red flags in her world. No reported conflicts with anyone. No threats, no arguments, no reason for concern. Her friends and family had no indication that anything was wrong. When they looked back after the fact, desperately searching for any sign they might have missed, there was nothing. She had never mentioned her downstairs neighbor to a single person. Not once, not to a friend, not to a family member, not in passing, not even to say that she found him strange or that something felt off. As far as Momona was concerned, life was fine. She had no idea that someone was watching, that someone was listening, that someone, just one floor below, had already begun to plan. While officers were still processing the scene upstairs, something else demanded their attention. Smoke was coming from the apartment directly below. By the time firefighters arrived, the unit was fully engulfed in flames. The fire burned with an intensity that suggested it had not started by accident. And when emergency responders finally got inside what remained of that apartment, they found a man inside. His name was Satoru Komodo. He was 48 years old. He was dead. The cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning. The fire, investigators would later confirm, had been deliberately set by Satoru himself. Then came the detail that tied everything together. When investigators examined Momona's balcony and the one directly below it, they found a ladder connecting the two. A ladder that had been installed intentionally, quietly, without anyone noticing. A bridge between his world and hers. Satoru's fingerprints were recovered from both weapons found inside Momona's apartment. The crowbar, the handmade spear, both of them. His prints were on both. Witnesses in the building reported seeing a man climbing up from the lower balcony to the one above before the attack. Others reported seeing that same man climb back down shortly after. Investigators also found that before ascending that ladder, Satoru had gone to Momona's front door and sealed it from the outside. He used tape to secure the door shut and wedged a doorstop underneath it, making sure it couldn't be opened from the inside. He had blocked her only other exit. There was no way out through the hallway. The only option would have been the balcony, the same balcony where the ladder was waiting. He had thought this through. Every detail, every contingency, every possible escape route. There was no question about what had happened. Satoru Komodo had climbed into Momona Yoshioka's apartment and attacked her with weapons he had prepared himself. And then he had gone back downstairs, set his apartment on fire, and waited to die. Understanding what Satoru did is one thing. Understanding who he was is something else entirely, and it matters, because the kind of person who plans something like this doesn't appear out of nowhere. Satoru Komodo had been living in that apartment building for approximately 5 years. He worked for a maintenance company, a job that frequently took him away from home for several days at a time. He lived alone. He had no family in the immediate area, no close relationships that anyone around him could point to. Neighbors described him as quiet, reserved, the kind of person you barely noticed, the kind of person who blended into the background of a building without leaving much of an impression. Most people who lived there said they didn't really know him at all. But beneath that unremarkable exterior, something had been building for a long time. Satoru had an extreme sensitivity to noise. Not the ordinary kind of annoyance that most people feel when a neighbor plays music too loud or talks on the phone late at night. This was something far beyond that. Something pathological. According to people who knew him, even the smallest, most imperceptible sounds were enough to send him into a state of agitation. Sounds that other people wouldn't even register, and the building, as far as Satoru was concerned, had become unbearable. No other resident in that building had ever filed a noise complaint. Nobody else reported any issues. There were no formal disputes on record, no incidents documented by building management, nothing that suggested the building had any unusual noise problems whatsoever. But for Satoru, it had become a source of unbearable torment. Shortly before the events of April 28th, Satoru had confided in an acquaintance that the noise disturbances in his building had gotten significantly worse. He spoke about it as though it were an escalating crisis, something that had crossed a line and could no longer be tolerated. The people around him had no idea how seriously he meant that. In the weeks leading up to Momona's death, the primary focus of Satoru's fixation was not her. It was the young man who lived in the apartment right next to his, a 20-year-old student who, by his own account, was one of the quietest tenants in the building. This student would later describe living next to Satoru as one of the most unsettling experiences of his life. In early April 2021, roughly 2 to 3 weeks before the attack, Satoru's behavior escalated sharply. He began pounding on the shared wall between their apartments in the middle of the night. Not just once, not just briefly, for hours, relentlessly, demanding that the noise stop. The student was baffled. He had been asleep. He wasn't making any noise. There was nothing to stop. But Satoru kept going, night after night, banging on the wall in the dark, furious about sounds that weren't there, or sounds so minute that no reasonable person could have been disturbed by them. The student said the experience left him genuinely frightened. Not just annoyed, frightened. He described Satoru as aggressive, completely irrational, someone who gave off the feeling that he was capable of real violence. During the day, when they crossed paths in the hallway, the student would offer a polite greeting, trying to keep things civil. Satoru never responded. Not once. He walked past him every single time as though he didn't exist. By mid-April, the student had had enough. The nightly disturbances were affecting his sleep, his sense of safety, his ability to function. He made the decision to move out and found a new place to live. He left the building. And in doing so, he unknowingly removed himself from the center of Satoru's world. The problem was, Satoru's fixation didn't dissolve when the student left. It simply redirected, and the nearest target, the person whose footsteps and daily movements Satoru heard most clearly through the ceiling of his apartment, was Momona. She was directly above him. She had probably been there, in the background of his paranoia, for a long time. But now, with the apartment next door empty, she became the sole focus. Momona had no idea. She never complained about Satoru. She never mentioned him. As far as her world was concerned, he didn't exist in any meaningful way. She was living her life, going to university, spending time with friends, sharing moments on Instagram, completely unaware that the man one floor below had decided that she was the source of everything that was wrong with his life. What makes this case so deeply disturbing is not just the violence, it is the deliberateness, the patience, the calculation. Satoru Komodo did not snap. He did not act in a moment of uncontrollable rage. He planned this. He planned it carefully, over the course of days, possibly weeks, while Momona went about her life completely unaware. Investigators examined his digital history and found searches for rope ladder and kerosene in the days before the attack. He visited a hardware store and purchased kerosene and a crowbar. He built the spear himself, taking the time to construct a weapon designed to be used at a distance, to keep the victim from being able to fight back effectively. He installed a ladder between the two balconies, doing it quietly enough that nobody noticed. He scouted her door and figured out how to seal it from the outside. Every step of this was thought through. Every contingency was addressed. The goal was not just to hurt Momona. The goal was to make sure she could not escape. And then, when it was done, when he had carried out what he had spent so much time planning, he went back downstairs. He set his apartment on fire. He sat down, and he waited. Satoru had clearly decided that this was how things would end for him too. He had no intention of facing consequences. No intention of explaining himself to police, to investigators, to anyone. Whatever was inside his mind, whatever logic or rage or delusion had driven him to that morning, he took it with him. Which means that the one question everyone wanted answered was never answered. Why Momona? There was no documented conflict between them. No record of any interaction, no complaints filed against her, no evidence that they had ever even spoken to each other in any meaningful way. Momona never said his name to anyone. She never described a problem. For her, he was just the neighbor downstairs. Someone she probably passed occasionally without a second thought. The only explanation investigators could construct was that Satoru's extreme sensitivity to sound had turned the ordinary, everyday noises of a young woman living her life above him into something he experienced as a constant, intolerable assault. The sound of her walking, her television, her phone calls, the mundane sounds of someone simply being alive in their home. To Satoru, that was apparently enough. There was no real trigger. No explosion, no final straw that makes sense from the outside. Just a man who had convinced himself over months and years that the people around him were ruining his life with noise that, in most cases, existed primarily in his own perception. And when the person next door left, all of that focused upward, onto a young woman who had never done anything to him, who had never even known he was a threat. Momona Yoshioka was 21 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. A life full of friends and warmth and small daily moments worth sharing. She deserved to live it. Instead, on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday morning in April, she became the victim of a plan that had been building beneath her feet for weeks, carried out by someone she had no reason to fear, executed with a coldness that is difficult to comprehend. The case was closed without a trial, without a confession, without answers. What remains is a ladder between two balconies, a door sealed shut from the outside, and the unbearable reality that sometimes the greatest dangers in our lives are the ones we never see coming, the ones that are already there, quiet and invisible, just one floor below.